You're the one who fixes the thing before anyone notices it was broken. A flickering bulb in the hallway, a weird grinding sound from the dryer, a mistake a coworker made that's heading straight for someone who won't be gentle about it. You just take care of it. No conversation about it, no announcement. There's this internal checklist running in the background of your head all the time, and most people don't even know it exists. And if someone catches you doing it and tries to thank you, you wave it off. Crack a small joke, change the subject, because to you, that's not something worth talking about. That's just Tuesday. If you were born between 1965 and 1972, you belong to a very specific slice of Generation X. The older half. The ones who didn't just grow up in the 1970s. You lived it. You remember it in your body. The wood-paneled station wagon with vinyl seats that scorched the backs of your legs in August. The rotary phone in the kitchen that weighed more than your school backpack. Saturday mornings that started with a bowl of cereal and Looney Tunes and ended whenever the streetlights buzzed on. You were one of the last generations of American kids whose parents had no idea where you actually were most of the day. Nobody had a tracking app. They just had trust and the assumption that you'd find your way home eventually. So let's talk about what makes the older Gen X man tick, where the wiring came from, what it cost, and what makes your experience genuinely different from the guys born even 5 or 6 years after you, because the gap is wider than people give it credit for. Start with the house you grew up in, not the layout, the rules. If you were born in the late 60s or early 70s, your parents were most likely boomers or late silent generation, and the rules in that house were not up for debate. There was a right way and a wrong way. There was what you were supposed to do and what happened if you didn't. The explanations were short. A lot of the time, they weren't there at all. You were taught to respect adults, not selectively, all of them. Teachers, neighbors, the guy pumping gas. You didn't talk back. You didn't make excuses. And if some adult corrected you, even unfairly, you took it on the chin. That was the deal. For boys, there was an extra layer underneath all that. You were taught, not always in words, but in everything you watched, that a man handles his business. He provides. He doesn't complain. He doesn't ask for help unless somebody's actively bleeding. You watched your father, your uncles, the guys on the block who fixed their own cars on Saturday morning. That was the model. Show up, do the work, keep your problems to yourself. Nobody called it toxic back then. Nobody called it anything. It was just how things were. And here's what nobody told you. A lot of those lessons stuck, not because you sat down at 38 and decided to adopt them. They were loaded onto your hard drive before you had the vocabulary to push back against them. You still show up early. You still fix things without being asked. You still measure your worth by what you produce today, not by how you felt while producing it. And on the surface, those look like solid traits. Reliable, dependable, useful, the kind of guy who gets things done. But there's a cost, and it takes about 3 decades to see it clearly. Because what they never taught you is what to do when you're tired. Not physically tired, you've got a graduate degree and pushing through that. Emotionally tired, the kind of tired where you've been holding the wall up for so long that your arms went past shaking, they just went numb. A lot of older Gen X men get to their early 50s and quietly realize they've been running a program that doesn't have a rest function. You know how to grind. You know how to show up when nobody else will. You know how to take a hit and keep walking. What you don't always know is how to say, I need to stop for a minute. Because that line was never in the script anyone handed you. Let's talk about nostalgia for a minute, because for you, it works differently than people understand. When you were a kid, the world moved at a different speed, literally slower. You didn't have the internet until you were already grown. You didn't have a cell phone in your pocket until your late 20s, maybe your 30s. When you wanted to know something, you went to the library, you asked somebody who might know, or you just didn't find out. The culture you absorbed was physical. Records, cassettes, paperbacks from the wire spinner rack at the grocery store. You had 3 channels on the TV, maybe 4 on a good day with a clear antenna. And the whole neighborhood watched the same show on the same night because there was nothing else on. That's why your nostalgia hits different than the nostalgia of the younger half of Gen X. The kids born in the late 70s and early 80s grew up in the MTV era. Cable was already normal by the time they were in middle school. The internet showed up while they were in college. Their cultural references are neon and synthesizer. Yours are wood grain and AM radio. You remember the tail end of Vietnam on the evening news. You remember the gas lines and the way your dad muttered through them. You were in the theater when Star Wars came out and changed the way movies looked forever. The younger half of Gen X caught those things on VHS, if they caught them at all. You were in the room when they happened. You remember Watergate, maybe not the specifics. You were small, but you remember the mood it left in the house, the way the adults talked about the government like it had personally let them down at the kitchen table. That ambient distrust didn't come from a textbook, it came from the living room. And that matters more than people realize, because by the time you hit your teen years, you already carried this quiet, low-grade understanding that the system wasn't necessarily looking out for you, that authority could be wrong, that the people in charge didn't always deserve the chair they were sitting in. That attitude shaped your entire work ethic. You didn't bust your back because you believed in the company. You busted your back because you believed in yourself. You figured if everything came apart, and things do come apart, you'd need to be the one still standing in the rubble. Research from Solson in 2025 found that Gen X is only about 20% of the American adult population, but holds roughly 31% of leadership positions across industries. And the personality trait that scored highest in Gen X men in that study wasn't charisma. It wasn't ambition, it was self-control. Gen X men landed at 46 out of 100 on that metric, higher than almost any other generation tested. You learned to manage yourself before anybody gave you a title or a reason to. And that self-control shows up everywhere, in how you handle conflict, in how you spend money, in how you parent, which is probably the place where your childhood and your adult choices collide the hardest. Because a lot of older Gen X men are raising their kids in the exact opposite way they were raised. Not because they hated their childhood, most of you didn't, not really, but because you noticed the gaps, the things nobody said, the conversations that never happened, the questions you had at 12 that nobody answered. Not because they didn't love you, because their generation just didn't think those conversations were necessary. So now you talk to your kids, you explain things, you try to make the invisible stuff visible, and sometimes it works. And sometimes your kid stares at you like you're reading off a manual they did not request. But here's where it gets interesting. You're sitting in a very particular seat right now. You're not young, you're not old. You're in the spot where everything lands on you at the same time. Pew Research found that more than half of American adults in their 40s, around 54%, have a living parent over 65 and at least one dependent child still at home. And for the older Gen X man specifically, that math is even more stacked because a lot of you had kids later. You started a family in your 30s, or even your 40s. So now you've got a teenager or a college-age kid and an aging parent who needs you more this year than last year. And 31% of people in that double-loaded position say they always feel rushed, not sometimes, always. Here's what nobody talks about. You don't complain about it. Because the wiring from your childhood, the handle your business programming, it's still running underneath everything. You absorb the pressure, you adjust the schedule, you drop your kid off at practice, drive across town to check on your dad, sit in traffic on the way home, wondering when was the last time you did something just because you wanted to. And if someone asks how you're doing, you say fine. That word is doing a tremendous amount of heavy lifting in your vocabulary. Let's talk about what actually separates you from the younger half of Gen X. Because it's more than just the year on your birth certificate. The guys born in the late 70s came up in a completely different cultural window. They had cable from the start, video games by elementary school. The internet showed up while they were still in high school. Their relationship with technology is closer to native, not millennial. They still remember life before screens, but they didn't have to cross the same bridge you did. You went from rotary phones to smartphones, from folded paper maps in the glove box to GPS reading you turn by turn, from the card catalog at the library to a search engine in your pocket. And you adapted. You learned the new tools, but you learned them the way someone learns a second language, fluently, but always aware it's not your first one. That shows up in how you use technology now. You don't merge your identity with it. You don't post every thought you have. You don't need a heart icon to validate a decision. You use the tools. You don't worship them. And there's a quiet confidence in that. Most of you don't even realize you have it. The younger Gen X guys are a little more plugged in, more likely to have a real social media presence, more likely to share publicly. Not dramatically different, they're still Gen X to the core. But the gap is there. They grew up with more options, more channels, more noise. Your childhood had fewer inputs, and that's exactly why the ones you had hit so hard. When you hear a song from 1978, it doesn't just bring back a memory, it brings back a temperature, a smell, the weight of a particular afternoon. Because you weren't splitting your attention across 6 screens, you were in the moment by default. Your brain recorded everything in high resolution because there was nothing competing with it. That's why your nostalgia is so specific. It's not a list of pop culture references, it lives in your body. And when something pulls it up, it doesn't take you back to a decade, it takes you back to a room. Now, here's the part that doesn't usually get said. You've learned things, hard things, things your father's generation would not have admitted out loud in public or in private. And here's what separates the older Gen X man today from the guy he was 20 years ago. You've started sorting out what was a lesson and what was a limitation. The work ethic stayed, the resilience stayed, the ability to stay calm while everything around you is loud. That one is real, and it serves you well. But the idea that asking for help is weakness, you've started to let that one go. Maybe not all the way, maybe not in front of everyone, but enough to know it isn't actually true. The idea that your feelings don't matter as long as the bills get paid, that one cracked somewhere around 45 and split wide open by 50. You realized your emotional life wasn't a luxury item. It was wired into everything else. Your health, your marriage, your ability to actually enjoy the thing you spent your whole adult life building. According to research from therapist.com, Gen X had their emotional needs deferred twice. First, in your own childhood, when adults were the center of the household and your job was to be quiet. Then again, when you became parents and the culture had completely flipped and now everything orbited around the kids. You got skipped both times. And a lot of you are only now in your 50s, circling back to ask yourselves the questions nobody asked you when you were young. Questions like, what do I actually want? Not what looks right from the outside. Not what I'm supposed to want. What do I want? Call it a midlife correction, because it isn't a crisis. It's the first honest inventory some of you have ever done, and it was overdue. You also figured out something about friendship that took decades to name. When you were young, friendship was just proximity. It was the kid on your street, the guys on your team, the people at the job. You didn't have to try. It just happened. Now it doesn't just happen. You have to make it happen. And that's harder than it sounds for a generation of men who were never taught how to maintain a relationship outside of obligation. You know how to show up for a job. You know how to show up for your family. Showing up for a friend on a Tuesday night just because you wanted to hear his voice. That's newer territory. But the guys who figured that one out, they'll tell you it changed everything. Because the loneliest version of yourself isn't the one who's actually alone. It's the one surrounded by people and still carrying the whole load by himself. The older Gen X man isn't broken. He's not a relic. He's not a cautionary tale about masculinity that didn't age well. He's a guy who was handed a set of tools as a kid, used them to build a life that mostly works, and is now standing back and quietly asking which tools still earn their place in the box, and which ones can be retired. That takes more courage than people give credit for. Tearing something down and starting over, that's dramatic. People understand dramatic. They make movies about dramatic. Sorting through 40 years of habits and quietly upgrading the ones that don't serve you anymore, while keeping the ones that still do, that's precision work. That's maturity. And that's exactly what the older Gen X man is doing right now, whether anyone around him notices or not. You don't need the credit. You never did. But it's still worth hearing, just one time, that what you're doing is harder than it looks. And the fact that you're doing it quietly doesn't make it less real. You were built to last. And here's the best part. You're still building.